Zara stumbled into the small, dimly lit apartment on Earth, her breath shallow and quick. Her vibrant purple skin, usually glowing with the grace of her alien race, was now pale, as if the energy had been drained from her. Every step she took was a struggle, her body aching from the intense injuries she had sustained. But the worst of her pain wasn't just physical, it was the crushing weight of failure that hung over her. She had come to Earth on a diplomatic mission, an attempt to broker peace between warring alien factions, but things had gone horribly wrong. Now, stranded and wounded, Zara had nowhere else to go. The apartment she had found herself in wasn't much, but it was safe for now. It smelled of Earth's food, something Jason, her human roommate, had clearly been cooking. Zara was supposed to be negotiating a delicate peace between her alien race and the humans, but instead, she had landed on this strange planet with only a handful of allies, none of whom knew what had happened. Zara couldn't afford to trust anyone, especially not a human. The idea of relying on a human, someone she saw as weak, was almost laughable. But here she was, and she had no other choice. She needed to heal, and this human would have to help her. Jason was a tall, awkward man with dark brown hair and a face that hadn't yet learned to hide the confusion and curiosity he often felt in the presence of alien species. His apartment was a chaotic blend of modern technology and old earthbound comforts. Zara had seen humans use both high-tech gadgets and primitive tools in her brief time on Earth, but the combination in Jason's apartment was unlike anything she had encountered. The scent of cooked food lingered in the air, a strange comfort amidst the pain that twisted through her body. She leaned against the doorframe for support, trying to steady her breathing, but the pain only worsened. It felt like something inside her was tearing, as if her own body was rejecting her mission, her failure. Just as she thought she might collapse right there, Jason walked out of the small kitchen. His eyes went wide when he saw her standing in the doorway, looking pale and on the brink of collapse. "Zara, what happened?" Jason rushed to her side, his eyes scanning her body, as if trying to figure out how to help. His face flushed, clearly shocked by her appearance. Zara, despite her pain, couldn't help but notice how his gaze lingered on her. It wasn't just concern. There was something else there, something she had seen many times before, but never from a human. "I'm fine," she said sharply, trying to hide the weakness in her voice. But the lie was thin and fragile. She winced as another wave of pain coursed through her. Jason didn't buy it for a second. He gently but firmly guided her to the small couch in the living room. "No, you're not fine. You're hurt. Let me help you." Zara hesitated. She had spent her entire life training to be strong, to never show weakness, to never rely on others. But here she was, desperate for help from the very species she had been taught to consider inferior. She didn't trust humans. She couldn't. And yet Jason's sincerity reached her in a way that was hard to ignore. "I said I'm fine," she repeated, her voice more strained than before. Her body was betraying her, and her mind was racing, trying to find a way out of this situation. Jason didn't listen to her protests. He pressed a small, cold device to her wrist, scanning her vitals. "You're burning up," he said softly, his eyes narrowing in concern. "You need medical help, Zara. And I don't think you're in any condition to argue right now." Zara's vision blurred slightly, the room spinning as the reality of her situation hit her like a crashing wave. The human, Jason, was right. She was in no condition to argue. Her body was failing, and she needed help. But the worst part was the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that washed over her. She was a warrior, a soldier, and yet here she was, vulnerable, unable to even stand on her own. "I need to fix the device," Zara murmured, trying to steady herself. Her alien communicator, the device that had malfunctioned during her mission, was the source of much of her pain. It was failing, and if she didn't fix it soon, it could cause a disaster, not just for her, but for the entire planet. But the more she tried to focus, the more her vision swam, and the less coherent her thoughts became. "Jason, seemingly sensing her distress, sat beside her on the couch. "What device? What's happening?" His voice was filled with worry, but Zara couldn't bring herself to explain. She was too weak, too embarrassed by her own failure. "Leave it," she said, voice cracking slightly. "It's not your problem." But Jason wasn't having it. He grabbed her hand gently, his fingers warm against her cool skin. "No, it is my problem now. You're hurt, and I'm not just going to sit by and let you suffer." Zara wanted to pull away, to tell him to leave her alone, but for some reason she didn't. There was something in his voice, a determination, a caring, that made her stay still. She had always kept others at arm's length, always pushed them away. But here, in this moment, in this strange place, something in her wanted to give in, to allow herself to be cared for. It was a weakness, she told herself, but it felt good in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. And that scared her more than anything. Jason stood up, looking down at her with a mix of frustration and concern. "You need rest. I'll figure this out. Just stay here." Zara nodded, though she wasn't sure she could stay awake much longer. As Jason moved to get something from the kitchen, she let her eyes close, but the questions kept swirling in her mind. Who could she trust? Was this human just another obstacle in her path, or could he be the one who could save her? The thought gnawed at her, and she had no answers. But one thing was certain. Her world was about to change forever. Zara lay on the couch, her body aching, her mind a haze of confusion. Her alien physiology was fragile in ways she had never expected. Even though her species was known for their strength and resilience, the injuries she had sustained from the failed mission were too much to bear. Her head throbbed, and her chest tightened with each breath. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, and it wasn't just physical. It was as if her entire being was failing her, rejecting her very existence. She clenched her fists in frustration, but that only made her injuries worse. Jason had left the room to get some supplies, but Zara could still feel his presence lingering in the air. There was something about him that made her feel strange. She had come to Earth with a mission, a purpose. To her, humans were weak and primitive. But now, as she lay helpless on this human's couch, she found herself questioning everything she had been taught. She had been trained to be independent, to never rely on anyone, especially not a human. And yet here she was, depending on Jason for help, feeling vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to before. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp pain in her side. She gasped and clutched at her chest, her vision blurring as another wave of agony washed over her. It felt like something was inside her, pushing against her, tearing her apart. The device she had been carrying, the one that was supposed to help her complete her mission, was malfunctioning. It was linked to her body, and every time it sent out an unstable pulse, it caused her more and more pain. She needed to fix it, but her hands were shaking too much to even think straight. Jason returned to the room, carrying a small medical kit and a glass of water. His eyes softened when he saw her struggling, and for a moment, Zara wished she could push him away. But she couldn't. The pain was unbearable. She felt as though every part of her body was on fire, and all she wanted was for it to stop. "Zara, you're burning up. I can't just sit here and watch you suffer," Jason said, kneeling beside her. His voice was filled with concern, but Zara could hear the hesitation in it. He didn't know what was wrong with her, but he was determined to help, even though she had made it clear that she didn't want his help. "I told you, I'm fine," she said, her voice weak. She wanted to push him away, tell him to leave her alone, but the words didn't come out the way she intended. Instead, they sounded more like a plea for help than a command. It frustrated her. She hated this feeling, being weak, being vulnerable, but she couldn't fight it. Jason carefully set the medical kit down on the table and looked at her with a mix of determination and concern. "You're not fine. You're in pain, and I can't just let you lie there. You need help." Zara turned her head away, trying to hide the tears that were welling up in her eyes. She had never allowed anyone to see her weakness, never let anyone get close enough to witness her pain. But Jason wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of her, or at least he didn't act like he was. He was just trying to help. "I don't need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was clear to both of them that she was lying. Jason could see it in her eyes. She was fighting to stay conscious, but the pain was too much for her to bear. She could feel herself slipping away, her vision growing darker with each passing moment. "Zara, listen to me," Jason said softly, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone anymore. You don't have to do this by yourself. Let me help you." Zara's heart skipped a beat as his hand gently squeezed hers. It wasn't just the physical touch that caught her off guard. It was the sincerity in his voice, the genuine care he had for her. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, pushing people away, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. But in this moment, as Jason held her hand and looked at her with such kindness, those walls began to crumble. "I'm not like the others," Jason continued, his voice steady. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to make sure you're okay." Zara closed her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She didn't want to be vulnerable, didn't want to admit that she needed help. But the reality was undeniable. She was dying. The device was killing her, and without it, she had no way to defend herself against the forces coming for her. "I can't fix it," Zara whispered, her voice breaking. "The device, it's broken. I don't know how to stop it." Jason's grip on her hand tightened, and she could feel his warmth, his strength. "We'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this. I'll help you, no matter what." For the first time in what felt like forever, Zara allowed herself to let go. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling Jason's presence like a lifeline pulling her from the edge of despair. She didn't know how to fix the device, and she didn't know what would happen next. But in this moment, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't alone. Jason had proven that. Despite the pain, despite the fear, Zara allowed herself to trust him. And in doing so, she found something she hadn't expected to find on Earth: hope. Jason stood up, his expression resolute. "We're going to get through this. I'm not leaving your side." Zara wanted to argue, to tell him that he had no idea what he was getting into, but the words died in her throat. She knew that Jason was right. She didn't have to face this alone. For the first time since arriving on Earth, Zara felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to survive. With Jason by her side, there was hope. And that was something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. Zara's body still ached from the damage, but the pain was different now. It was more manageable, though the strange feeling of vulnerability lingered in her chest. Jason hadn't left her side, staying close in ways she couldn't quite understand. His presence was comforting, yet there was a weight to it, a tension that grew with each passing moment. The days following the incident felt like a blur. They had stayed inside, keeping a low profile. Zara didn't trust the outside world anymore. She had been an alien on Earth, sent for a mission that now felt meaningless. Her mission was lost, her body broken, and the one human she had always viewed with disdain was now the only person keeping her alive. It was a hard pill to swallow. As Zara sat up, her gaze caught Jason as he moved around the room, gathering various tools and supplies. There was something about the way he moved, with purpose and determination. He wasn't a soldier like she had been, but in this moment, he felt like one. A sense of duty radiated from him, a protective instinct that was both foreign and strangely comforting to her. "Jason," she called out, her voice hoarse. He looked up from his work, his brow furrowed in concern. "Yeah, Zara. What's wrong?" "I don't know how long I can keep pretending I'm okay," she said softly, her gaze falling to the floor. The words felt heavier than she expected. She had always prided herself on being strong, but here she was, asking for help. It made her feel weak, and that was something she couldn't accept. Jason walked over and knelt beside her, his eyes searching hers. "Zara, you're not pretending. I can see you're struggling. But I'm here. I'll do whatever it takes to help you." She felt a rush of emotions that she wasn't ready to deal with. She had trained herself to shut down emotions long ago, but Jason was breaking through her defenses. There was a part of her that wanted to push him away, but another part, the part she didn't want to admit existed, was grateful for his presence. "I can't do this," Zara whispered, almost to herself. "I can't fix the device, and I can't go back to my people like this. I failed." Jason's face softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet. We'll figure it out. You don't have to carry this alone." Zara's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the reality of the situation was so much harder than that. She had always believed in herself, but now, with Jason by her side, she had to admit that she didn't know what to do. She had no idea how to survive without the device that had been linked to her body for so long. As she looked up at him, something shifted. She realized that maybe she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. Maybe there was more to Earth and its people than she had been taught. But that didn't change the danger that still lurked in the shadows. They weren't out of the woods yet. They weren't safe. Suddenly, the air in the room grew cold. Zara stiffened, her senses on high alert. Jason looked confused for a moment but quickly followed her gaze to the window. Something was wrong. Zara's hand instinctively went to her side, where her weapon used to be, but it was gone. It had been taken from her when she was incapacitated. "Jason, get ready. Someone's coming," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. He didn't hesitate. He immediately stood, reaching for the makeshift weapons they had scavenged from the apartment. He wasn't a trained fighter, but he wasn't about to let her face whatever was coming alone. Zara could feel her heart race in her chest. She had expected this, knew it would come to this. The moment she was vulnerable, her enemies would find her. She didn't know who they were, but she could sense the danger closing in. Her species had always been hunted, and now she was the prey. The door rattled, and a low thud echoed from outside. Jason's eyes widened, his pulse quickening. He was ready, but Zara could see the uncertainty in his movements. He was still just a human, and she was still a broken alien. Zara stood up, despite the pain that shot through her body. She had no choice. She had to protect Jason, protect herself. She couldn't let anyone take her without a fight. Not again. "We need to move," she said, her voice sharper now. "They're coming for us." Jason nodded, his face set in determination. He grabbed the flashlight, signaling her to follow. They crept toward the back door, trying to remain as silent as possible. Zara could hear the faint whisper of footsteps outside, the slow, calculated movements of someone, or something, approaching. They were close. Zara's mind raced. Who were they? Were they from her world? Or had someone else tracked her down? She had no answers, only the pressing need to survive. Jason reached the back door first, peeking out through a crack in the wall. His face went pale as he took in what he saw. Zara stepped beside him, her senses sharpening, her breath steady. A group of humanoid figures stood just outside, their forms cloaked in shadows. They were armed, their weapons raised, scanning the area for any signs of movement. They weren't from Earth. Zara could tell by the way they moved, too precise, too organized. "They know we're here," Zara murmured, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Jason glanced at her, his expression a mix of fear and resolve. "What do we do?" Zara took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. "We fight," she said simply, her tone unwavering. As the door creaked under their weight, the figures outside began to turn, sensing the disturbance. And in that moment, Zara knew that everything was about to change. There was no turning back now. It was a fight for survival, and she would not let herself, or Jason, fall without one. The tension from their narrow escape hung in the air, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Jason and Zara had retreated into the shadows of the abandoned building, hearts racing, their every movement careful and calculated. They had managed to avoid detection, but Zara's mind couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep inside her. Every minute spent hiding felt like an eternity. Zara's body still ached from the wounds, but it was the emotional pain that was starting to feel unbearable. She had always been strong, trained to withstand the harshest of environments. But this was different. She had never experienced such a level of vulnerability. As an alien, she had always been taught to be self-reliant, to trust no one but her own kind. But now, here she was, relying on Jason, someone she had once thought was weak. She couldn't understand it. She couldn't understand why he kept helping her, why he stayed by her side, despite all the danger. Jason had been nothing short of a lifesaver. He had carried her when she couldn't walk, provided her with whatever she needed, and constantly reassured her when the darkness of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. But Zara couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was off. She had been trained to recognize when someone was hiding something. It was instinctual, like a sixth sense. As they huddled together in the cold, concrete room, Zora's thoughts spiraled. She couldn't let herself get too attached. Humans were unpredictable, unreliable. Yet here she was, clinging to him like he was the only thing that mattered. She hated that she had become so emotionally vulnerable, but it was happening, and she didn't know how to stop it. The worst part was, she didn't know if she wanted to stop it. Jason was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, staring out into the dimly lit hallway. His face was drawn, tired from the constant tension, but his eyes never wavered. He was keeping watch, but Zara could see the exhaustion behind his gaze. She felt a pang of guilt. She was the reason he was here, the reason he was putting himself in danger. It was her fault. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not really expecting him to hear her. Jason glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Sorry? What for?" Zara shook her head, not knowing how to explain the swirling confusion inside her. "For dragging you into this. You didn't ask for this." Jason let out a small chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He leaned forward, placing his hands on his knees. "I didn't ask for it, but I'm here, and I'm not leaving you." He paused for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "We're in this together, Zara. I'm not going to abandon you." Zara's heart fluttered at his words, but she quickly suppressed the feeling. She couldn't afford to be distracted by emotions. She had to remain focused. But Jason's sincerity was undeniable. She had never met a human like him. Someone who cared so deeply for her well-being. Someone who wouldn't let her suffer alone. Suddenly, a loud bang interrupted her thoughts, making both of them freeze. Jason immediately rose to his feet, grabbing the nearby weapon they had taken from a fallen enemy. His eyes met Zara's, filled with determination. "Stay here," Jason whispered, his voice low and urgent. Zara's eyes narrowed. She wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. She was still a warrior, even if she was injured. "I'm coming with you." Jason hesitated, but before he could protest, Zara pushed herself to her feet. The room spun for a moment, but she steadied herself, clenching her fists. She wasn't going to be a helpless victim. Not again. They moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, the darkness swallowing them as they crept through the building. The air was thick with tension, and Zara's senses were on high alert. Whoever had found them wasn't far away. As they rounded the corner, they came face to face with a shocking sight. Standing in the hallway, bathed in the faint light from a broken window, was another figure, a figure Zara recognized all too well. It was one of her own kind. Her heart stopped in her chest. How could this be? How had they found her? She had done everything to avoid detection. Had she been followed from the beginning? But the worst part wasn't the realization that her people were after her. It was the cold, emotionless look in the alien's eyes. This wasn't a simple rescue mission. This was a betrayal. "Zara," the alien said, his voice smooth and commanding. "You've made a grave mistake. You should have returned when you had the chance. Zara felt a chill run down her spine. This was the last person she had expected to encounter. He was a high-ranking officer, someone who had once been a trusted ally. But now, it seemed he had been sent to eliminate her. Jason stepped in front of Zara instinctively, his hand gripping the weapon tightly. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he could sense the threat in the air. "Who are you?" Jason demanded, his voice steady but filled with authority. The alien's eyes flicked over to Jason, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't concern you, human," he said coldly. "Move aside." Zara stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let this happen. Not like this. She had to take control of the situation, to regain some semblance of the strength she once had. "You're wrong," Zara said, her voice firm. "This does concern him, and you're not taking me." The alien's lips twisted into a smirk. "You think you can stop me? You've already failed, Zara. You're nothing without your device. You've already lost." Zara's chest tightened at his words. It was true. Without the device, she was vulnerable. But what he didn't understand was that she wasn't alone anymore. She had Jason, and together, they were stronger than he could ever imagine. "I haven't lost yet," Zara said, her voice low but filled with defiance. The alien's smirk faltered, but before he could act, Zara lunged at him, driven by the desperation of betrayal and the need to protect Jason. The fight was far from over, and Zara was ready to do whatever it took to survive. But as she clashed with her former ally, she couldn't shake the feeling that this betrayal was just the beginning of something far darker. The tension in the air was suffocating as the fight continued. Zara's heart raced as she faced the alien officer, a figure she once trusted, but now as nothing more than an enemy. His words echoed in her mind, "You've already lost." But Zara refused to let that be true. She was fighting not only for her own survival, but for the future that seemed to be slipping away from her. And Jason, he was counting on her. The alien officer was powerful, his strength enhanced by his high-ranking position in the alien forces. But Zara had her own skills, and the anger surging through her veins gave her an edge. She had trained for moments like this, when all seemed lost, when there was no choice but to fight with everything she had. But the pain in her body was still there, lingering from her earlier injuries. She wasn't as fast or strong as she had been before. She had to push through it, though. There was no turning back now. Jason stood at her side, weapon raised, but his eyes were filled with hesitation. He had never fought like this before, never been thrust into a battle of life and death. He was a soldier, yes, but this was different. This was a war on an entirely new scale, one where he was the underdog, fighting against a technologically advanced alien force. Still, he stood by her, his loyalty unwavering. Zara could feel it, and in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. The alien officer lunged forward, moving with lightning speed, his weapon aimed at Zara. She barely had time to react, but instinct kicked in, and she ducked just in time, hearing the hiss of energy as the officer's weapon missed her by mere inches. The heat from the blast singed her skin, and she winced in pain, but there was no time to focus on it. Zara rolled to the side, quickly gaining her footing. She grabbed a shard of metal from the floor, using it as a makeshift weapon. The officer was fast, but Zara's agility was a match for his strength. She attacked, her movements sharp and precise. She struck the officer's arm, causing him to stagger back in surprise. For a moment, it felt like she had the upper hand, but then the officer recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing with fury. He wasn't going to make the same mistake again. "Do you think you can defeat me, Zara?" The officer sneered, his voice filled with malice. "You're weak without your device, without your people. You've already lost. You always will." Zara's jaw clenched as she looked at him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I've lost nothing," she replied, her voice filled with defiance. "I'm not alone anymore." Jason stepped forward, his face set in determination, "And I'm not backing down either," he said, his voice strong, though it trembled slightly. He had never faced an enemy like this before. The alien officer was a force to be reckoned with, but Jason had something more powerful than any weapon. He had the will to protect those he cared about. The alien officer turned his gaze on Jason, dismissing him as though he were a mere nuisance. With a flick of his wrist, the officer unleashed a blast of energy at Jason, sending him crashing into the wall. Zara screamed in horror as she saw him crumple to the ground. The pain of seeing him hurt hit her like a tidal wave. This was the moment she feared. Her bond with Jason was growing stronger, and she could no longer ignore the fact that she cared for him more than she should. No, she couldn't let him die. She couldn't let her feelings get in the way of their survival. He had fought for her. He had saved her. Now it was her turn. With a roar of fury, Zara rushed toward the alien officer, her fear and pain fueling her determination. She would not let Jason's sacrifice be in vain. She was ready to give everything. In that split second, everything else faded away. The officer, the battle, the pain. All that mattered was protecting the one person who had stood by her side. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for him, for the chance to see him live. The alien officer, caught off guard by Zara's fury, raised his weapon to defend himself. But Zara was faster. She lunged, driving the shard of metal into his side, deep enough to draw blood. The officer gasped, faltering for a moment, but his eyes burned with rage, and Zara knew this wouldn't be over so easily. He was more powerful than she was, and the wound she had inflicted might not be enough to stop him. Still, she had to try. Had imparted in their short time together. She had always believed in fighting for something bigger than oneself. She had believed in the cause, in the future of humanity. And that was what Jason needed to focus on. He had to keep fighting, not for his own survival, but for the survival of everyone they had lost and everyone they still had to protect. "I may not have all the answers," Jason said, his voice steady despite the pain he felt inside. "But I know one thing. We can't let Zara's death be in vain. We have a chance to win this war, to fight back against the alien forces. We've lost so much already, but we can't stop now. We owe it to her, and to everyone who's given their lives for this cause, to keep going. We will honor her memory by finishing what she started. Together, we will win." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, one by one, the soldiers nodded in agreement. Jason saw the fire return to their eyes, the same fire he had seen in Zara's eyes. They were ready to keep fighting. They were ready to finish the war, to honor the sacrifice of their fallen comrades. As Jason turned to leave the command center, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the challenges they faced were enormous. But he was no longer afraid. He had seen what humanity was capable of, seen the strength that lay within them, and he had seen it in Zara. Her strength, her courage, her unwavering belief in the cause. These were the things that would carry him forward. Jason knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more sacrifices, and more pain. But he also knew that humanity had something the alien forces didn't: the power of hope, of unity, of love for one another. And as long as he carried that with him, as long as he remembered Zara's sacrifice, he would fight with everything he had. The war wasn't over, but they had a chance. And as Jason stepped out into the battlefield, he knew that he wasn't alone. He had the strength of Zara's memory, the strength of every fallen soldier, and the strength of humanity's will to survive. Together, they would fight for a better future. Together, they would win. And though Zara was gone, her spirit lived on in each of them, lighting the way forward.